Hi everyone and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel Rightside Blonde. Remember when Tucker Carlson was still on Fox News and he did this segment?
One thing you should know is that the most popular president in American history was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon. Yet somehow, without a single vote being cast by a single American voter, Richard Nixon was kicked out of office and replaced by the only unelected president in American history. So we went from the most popular president to a president nobody voted for. Wait a minute, you may ask. Why didn't I know that? Wasn't Richard Nixon a criminal? Wasn't he despised by all decent people? No, he wasn't. In fact, if any president could claim to be the people's choice, it was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was reelected in 1972 by the largest margin of the popular vote ever recorded before or since. Nixon got 17 million more votes than his opponent. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign. And in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald Ford took over the White House. How did that happen? Well, it's a long story, but here are the highlights, and they tell you a lot. Richard Nixon believed that elements in the federal bureaucracy were working to undermine the American system of government, and had been doing that for a long time. He often said that. He was absolutely right. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA director Richard Helms at the White House. During the conversation, which thankfully was tape recorded, Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. Helms's telling response? Total silence. But for Nixon, it didn't matter because it was already over. 4 days before, on June 19th, the Washington Post had published the first of many stories about a break-in at the Watergate office building. Unbeknownst to Nixon and unreported by the Washington Post, 4 of the 5 burglars worked for the CIA. The first of many dishonest Watergate stories was written by a 29-year-old Metro reporter called Bob Woodward. Who exactly was Bob Woodward? Well, he wasn't a journalist. Bob Woodward had no background whatsoever in the news business. Instead, Bob Woodward came directly from the classified areas of the federal government. Shortly before Watergate, Woodward was a naval officer at the Pentagon. He had a top-secret clearance. He worked regularly with the intel agencies. At times, Woodward was even detailed to the Nixon White House, where he interacted with Richard Nixon's top aides. Soon after leaving the Navy, for reasons that have never been clear, Woodward was hired by the most powerful news outlet in Washington and assigned the biggest story in the country. And just to make it crystal clear what was actually happening, Woodward's main source for his Watergate series was the deputy director of the FBI, Mark Felt. And Mark Felt ran, and we're not making this up, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was designed to secretly discredit political actors the federal agencies wanted to destroy. People like Richard Nixon. And at the same time, those same agencies were also working to take down Nixon's elected vice president, Spiro Agnew. In the fall of 1973, Agnew was indicted for tax evasion and forced to resign. His replacement was a colorless congressman from Grand Rapids called Gerald Ford. What was Ford's qualification for the job? Well, he had served on the Warren Commission, which absolved the CIA of responsibility for President Kennedy's murder. Nixon was strong-armed into accepting Gerald Ford by Democrats in Congress. Quote, "We gave Nixon no choice but Ford," Speaker of the House Carl Albert later boasted. 8 months later, Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission was the President of the United States. See how that works?
Fast forward to today and we see Bobby Kennedy pairing up with Donald Trump. And I've seen a lot of rumors that Bobby Kennedy might take over the CIA or at least oversee parts of it. Wouldn't that be interesting? Let's go back to Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Wouldn't it have been really cool if John Kennedy had interviewed Gerald Ford back in the 90s? Well, he did. And that's what I want to read today. This is from the special election issue from November of 1996. And John Kennedy sat down with Gerald Ford and asked him some questions. So let's get right into it. The article starts with a quote from William Shakespeare. It says, "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." If you've ever wondered whether it's possible to ascend to presidency without ever seeking it, Gerald Ford will tell you that it is. In 1973, Ford was House Minority Leader, a well-liked career congressman contemplating retirement after his next campaign. Then, in a bewildering succession of serendipitous events, He became the compromise choice for vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace. Ford served Richard Nixon faithfully for the next 9 months until he himself was handed the top job, following the president's resignation in August 1974. During his 2-year presidency, Gerald Ford presided over the fall of Saigon, pardoned Nixon, continued negotiations of the SALT Treaty, and made Chevy Chase a household name. He ran for re-election in 1976, but after being bloodied by Ronald Reagan's relentless challenge for the Republican nomination, Ford narrowly lost the general election to the political outsider Jimmy Carter. In many ways, Ford is not unlike the man whose portrait he chose to hang in the cabinet room, Harry Truman. Both men fell into the presidency by historical accident, and, at least initially, were regarded by many as not being up to the job. Both made decisions early on in their terms that later defined their presidencies, Truman choosing to drop the A-bomb, Ford pardoning his predecessor. Both presided over the conclusion of a lengthy war and afterwards had to contend not only with a communist adversary, but also with the persistent charge that they were soft on their Eastern Bloc foes. Each inspired public affection, less for the abilities that distinguished them than for the very ordinariness that kept them accessible and familiar to their constituents. And when their time was up, each made a seamless re-entry into private life with no regrets or bitterness, comfortable with their accomplishments and with themselves. Gerald Ford was born Leslie Lynch King Jr., named after his biological father, whom he reportedly saw only twice. He was renamed after his adoptive father, a modest paint store owner described by Ford as a man of impeccable integrity and singularly important influence on his life. He became a football star at the University of Michigan, playing against the Chicago Bears in the college All-Star game in 1935. After graduating, he was offered a job at Yale coaching boxing and football, and in 1938 he entered Yale Law School. His graduation class included a future Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, and Peace Corps Director Sargent Shriver. Ford married Elizabeth Bloomer in Grand Rapids in 1948. Their 2-day honeymoon was spent watching a Michigan Northwestern football game and attending a speech by Thomas Dewey. Later that year, Ford ran for Congress and won. He was elected 12 consecutive times, each with more than 60% of the vote. Following Spiro Agnew's resignation in October of 1973, President Nixon offered Ford the vice presidency. Nixon had been informed by Senate leaders that his first choices, John Connally and Nelson Rockefeller, would have trouble getting confirmed. On August 9, 1974, interesting date, 8 months and 3 days after he became vice president, Ford was sworn in as president.
Mr. Chief Justice, my dear friends, my fellow Americans, the oath that I have taken is the same oath that was taken by George Washington and by every president under the Constitution. But I assume the presidency under extraordinary circumstances never before experienced by Americans.
Our long national nightmare is over, he said, following the ceremony in the East Room of the White House. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. I met up with Gerald Ford shortly after the Republican convention in San Diego, where he had delivered a tart yet well-received speech during prime time. Seeing his signature gap-toothed grin and his large, remarkably round head, I was struck by how little his physical appearance has changed over the past 20 years. Those close to him say one of the few outward signs of his advancing age, he's 83, is his occasional orneriness when besieged by requests, such as mine, that clutter his schedule. 41 men have occupied the presidency. Only 4 are still around to talk about it. Even in this rarefied group, Ford stands out as the only man in American history to reach the presidency without ever having run for national office. One day, Gerald Ford woke up and became vice president. Another day, he woke up and became president. For that reason, his perspective on the presidency is unique. John asks, you were first elected to Congress in 1948. Was there the same level of partisanship and division then that there seems to be today? Or was there a greater air of collegiality? Ford said, there was a lot more civility. We had our partisan debates, and they could be very intense, but when you got through, you could be friendly with the person you debated. Over the years, among my closest friends were people like Speakers of the House Tip O'Neill and John McCormick. We could be tough adversaries, but never enemies. I get the feeling that today, they just don't have the same relationships. John asks, why did it change? I think opening the House chamber to television had a lot to do with it. It's a different atmosphere because both Democrats and Republicans, knowing the camera is on, try to be a little more vigorous and a little more adamant, and the language gets stronger. John asks, did you have any inkling that Nixon was going to pick you after Spiro Agnew resigned? Ford replies, I had no special knowledge about how serious the charges were against Agnew. About a day before Agnew resigned, I was asked to come down and meet with President Nixon in the middle of the day, and he asked me to come and visit him at his special office over in the Executive Office Building, which was an unusual request. So I went down there and we sat for about an hour and a half. I had known Dick Nixon since the day I was elected to Congress. But it was strange because there just didn't seem to be any purpose to the meeting. While I was there, I got a call about a big vote in the House, so I left. In retrospect, I had the feeling he was giving me a last survey as to whether he was going to nominate me or not. John said, when did you find out? Ford replies, when I got to the floor of the House, everybody came running to me and said, Agnew's resigned, Agnew's resigned. It was strange that Nixon never told me. Now the rumors were that Nelson Rockefeller, Ronald Reagan, or George Bush would succeed him. The night before Nixon actually made the decision, Mrs. Ford and I were watching television. Former Defense Secretary Mel Laird called and said, would you accept the vice presidency? And I told him that I had no ambitions, I hadn't planned on it. He said, well, the White House wants to know if you would accept it if it were offered to you. I said, I think I would, as part of my political career. Later, I found out that the Rockefeller nomination wouldn't have made it because the conservative Republicans wouldn't accept it. The Reagan nomination wouldn't go because the liberal Republicans wouldn't accept it. And John Connally was in trouble because he had switched parties. John asked, when did President Nixon actually ask you? And Ford said, apparently, Nixon called Carl Albert and Mike Mansfield, who were the Democratic leaders then, to talk to them about the vice presidency. And Carl Albert said, well, why don't you nominate Jerry Ford? He could get you the House and Senate without any trouble. The next day, the announcement was made. John asked, how well did you know President Nixon prior to that? Were you acquaintances or friends? And Ford replied, the first day I was sworn in as a congressman after I took the oath with everybody else, a fellow came up to me and said, I'm Dick Nixon from California. I'm glad to meet you. And I'm pleased you're here. From then on, we became close friends. We were both members of a little semi-social group called the Chowder Marching Society, where our wives and us would get together. He came to Michigan to campaign for me, and I went to California to campaign for him. I would say we were close friends. I was as close a friend to him as almost anybody in Congress. John asked, if Al Gore is on one end of the spectrum as the ideally involved vice president, and on the other end is John Nance Garner, who said his job as vice president wasn't, quote, worth a pitcher of warm piss, where along that spectrum do you believe your tenure belongs? Ford said, well, those 9 months that I was vice president were, I think, quite different than any other. The Watergate problems kept getting worse and worse. The problems in Vietnam became more accelerated. It was a period of unusual tension in the White House, which had to be reflected in my relationship with the president. Not that our personal relations were bad, but the staff of the White House were so sensitive about any comment that I made. If I were too supportive of Nixon and something turned up, then it would have made me look ridiculous. The media would have accused me of being a patsy. If I were too critical of Nixon, if I backed off and criticized him, undercutting him in public, the impression would have been that I was trying to get rid of him so I could be president, so it was tricky. John said, there is the story that then Chief of Staff Alexander Haig came to you with the news of the smoking gun tape. What was your reaction to the news? Did you feel betrayed? And Ford said, well, I had asked President Nixon more than once, is there any involvement of the White House in Watergate? And I was told categorically no. I was told the same by John Mitchell, who was then Attorney General. So I proceeded on that premise, right up to the point when Al Haig came to me that afternoon, I think it was a Friday, and said, there's going to be new evidence. The smoking gun tape will be released on Monday. I'm just warning you that when those tapes are released to the press, the problems are going to multiply. This new evidence will make a significant difference in the Judiciary Committee. He went on to say, I can't tell you what Nixon is going to do because he is ambivalent. He is either going to fight it or resign. When the tapes were released on that Monday, the whole situation changed 180 degrees. He was either going to be impeached and probably convicted by the Senate, or he was going to resign. And those were two tough choices. He finally made the choice to resign. John said, do you remember what was going through your head when you and Mrs. Ford walked with the Nixons to the helicopter for his final goodbye? Ford said, that morning, my wife and I went to the White House. Of course, Betty had been a very good friend of Pat's, as I had been with the president. We walked together with the two of them out to the helicopter. And it was a very, very traumatic experience because of our long friendship and acquaintanceship. And what can you say? You just say you're sorry and you say you wish it hadn't happened, which I did, but you can't say much more than that. John said, the presidency is such an exclusive club that there must be experiences or feelings that only others who have been there can really share. Is there a particular president or presidents who you felt a special closeness to or empathy with while you were president? And Ford replies, well, every president has the opportunity to pick 3 former presidents with whom to have their photographs or paintings on display in the cabinet room. Each president picks 2 from his own party and 1 from the other party. Anyhow, when I had my choice, I took Lincoln, Truman, and Eisenhower. Eisenhower and Truman had both been presidents during my first years in Congress, and of course Abraham Lincoln was a long-standing hero of mine, not only because he kept the country from being divided, but he wanted to be absolutely certain that slavery would be ended. John asked, what was the most difficult decision that you made during your presidency? And Ford replies, there is no question that domestically it was the decision to pardon President Nixon. It was by far the most difficult because I was the only person who could sign that document granting the pardon. Today, I'm more convinced than I was 20-some years ago that it was the right decision. John said, some people suspect that the decision cost you the election in 1976. Why did you finally decide to grant the pardon? And Ford said, when I became president, we had some very serious problems on my desk. We had high interest rates, unemployment was going up, the whole economy was on the brink of a serious recession. We had the problems of the communists, we had a Middle East crisis, we had the Cyprus problem. At the same time, I was spending 25% of my time listening to the advice of lawyers from the Department of Justice and from my own legal staff in the White House on what I should do about Mr. Nixon's tapes, his papers, etc. The first press conference I had about 3 weeks after I became president, 90% of the questions were, what was I going to do about Mr. Nixon? As I walked back from the East Room to the Oval Office, I said to myself, I ought to be spending 100% of my time on the problems of the country. So I said to my counsel, I said, would you see what I can do to get this problem off my desk? And the answer was very simple, a pardon. John said, you alone made the decision? And Ford said, we investigated the details and so forth, and finally I made the decision. My staff was generally against it. John said, did you anticipate that it would become as big a campaign issue as it proved to be? And Ford said, well, I must admit, I didn't think it would be as serious a problem politically as it was. Of course, I was asked many times, why did you do it then? Why didn't you wait until Mr. Nixon was indicted, until he was convicted, until he appealed to the Supreme Court? That would have taken at least a 2-year period, and that would have been the major headline in every newspaper throughout the country. It would have been on every TV show. So the only way to do it was to do it promptly and to get it off my desk, and it had an impact on the election, no question. John said, did you and President Nixon ever talk about it afterward? And Ford said, we never talked about it. No, never. John said, it never came up? And Ford said, it was just not something we ever talked about. Interesting. John said, what from your experience was the best and the worst parts about being president? And Ford said, the best is the feeling that, to a degree, you can actually do something to make things better for the country. The most difficult is the failure to be able to turn a switch and solve the problems before you, or the inability to turn a switch and solve the problems in the Middle East. Presidents do have a lot of power, but not as much as the press and the public generally think. And that inability to do things overnight, I think, is the most discouraging part of being president. John asked Gerald Ford questions about his relationship with Ronald Reagan and Bob Dole, and then goes on to ask this question. Bob Dole has a quote in his book, if you want to know who your friends are, try losing an election. How does it feel to lose a presidential election? It seems that few things in life are as all-consuming. Ford replied, well, we came very close to winning. We tried hard. My whole lifetime, whether in athletics or politics, my philosophy always was, do what you can to win. If you lose, don't sit around and worry about it. There's another day, another opportunity, or something down the road. So even though we lost, I was ready to find something else that would be constructive and interesting. And I did. John said, did it take a while to do that, or did you bounce back quickly? And Ford replied, pretty quickly. I think it was harder for my wife and my children than it was for me. John said, why is that? Ford said, the family got very deeply involved in the campaign. Betty and the children all campaigned, and they felt very strongly that I was a better choice than Jimmy Carter. John asked, are you close to any of the former presidents? After all, there are only 4 of you. And Gerald Ford said, yes, even though Jimmy Carter and I had some pretty sharp words through our campaign, we've become good friends. I've gone to his library and museum, and he has come to mine. We have worked together on a number of issues such as NAFTA. We have a good rapport. You know, my wife has a very good relationship with Mrs. Carter. We also knew your mother and father very well. One of the sad duties I had was to serve as a member of the Warren Commission. John asks, and this is where it gets interesting, why do you think you were chosen to serve on the commission? And Gerald Ford said President Johnson wanted a bipartisan group. He first convinced the Chief Justice to do it. Then he got former Senator Dick Russell, former Senator John Sherman Cooper, and former Congressman Hale Boggs. And he wondered who, as a Republican in the House, would balance Hale Boggs. I understand former Defense Secretary Bob McNamara recommended me. President Johnson called me. I think it was on a Sunday night after your father was assassinated. And Lyndon said, I want you to serve on this bipartisan group. I said, I've got all these responsibilities in the House, and really, I can't do it. Lyndon said, you have to. I'm going to twist your arm until you do. So I said I would. John said, you wrote a book some years later, right? And Gerald Ford said, I wrote a book called Portrait of the Assassin. John said, was the book in response to all of the conjecture? And Ford said this, I am a firm believer today, as I was previously, rigidly, that Lee Harvey Oswald committed the assassination. Our commission found no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. I feel very strongly about it. I regret people like Oliver Stone and conspiracy theorist Mark Lane and the others who have made a buck out of a tragedy of American history. I try to defend what the commission did. I'm the only one from the commission who's still around today. I really resent what a lot of the press have done in this area too, because the truth is, John, there is no new significant evidence that's been produced. There have been different interpretations of the basic evidence, but there's no doubt in my mind that Lee Harvey Oswald committed the assassination. John said, with the benefit of nearly 20 years of hindsight now, do you think there's a role in public life for a former president, or do you think former presidents are better removed from the fray? Ford said, I think it depends on the person. I continued my political activity every 2 or 4 years because I felt strongly about my views and about the party. Others have been less active. I don't think Jimmy Carter has been very active, period. He's had other interests. I don't know about George Bush. President Nixon was less active. So I think it depends on the personality. One thing I'm vigorously opposed to, some have said, why don't you have a council of former presidents? That would just be another bureaucratic level, and we don't need more, we need less. John's last question was, if President Clinton were to lose in November and he called you for advice on what he should do with his life, what would you tell him, one ex-president to another? And Ford replies, a young person like Bill Clinton, if he loses, ought to say to himself, there are a lot of wonderful opportunities down the road, and if he asked me for advice, I would tell him one thing, don't sulk. That was a very interesting exchange about the Warren Commission and JFK's assassination. And the wonderful thing about magazines is that it's in print. You can't take the words back. It's not the internet. You can't erase it. You can't edit it years from now. It's here, and each issue is like its own little time capsule, meant for people like me to look through these years into the future to discuss it with people like you watching. So thank you for watching. That does it for this episode of the George Collection. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.
Of this extraordinary magazine, George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process. And while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.